Right?
Yep.
Okay. So Lucy, first of all then, so we can check our levels are okay, tell me your name and your occupation, please.
So my name is Lucy Led and I'm the archivist at the Wedgwood Museum.
Fantastic. So first question, and I know it's a bit broad kind of question, but historically, in your opinion, what kind of a role have women played in the ceramics industry in Stoke and North Staffordshire?
So women have always had quite an important role in the ceramics industry. When it was first a cottage industry, you often see women working alongside the rest of their families as a way of supplementing the family income. And then as the industry really takes off and develops, again, women are still provide quite a large proportion of the total workforce in North Staffordshire.
So traditionally over the years then, and I mean when I say over the years, I mean I'm thinking sort of, you know, since the Great War basically, and maybe a bit before that, what kind of a role, what kind of a job and what kind of a role have women had?
Women traditionally, especially after the beginning, well, if I start again, women have traditionally done the sort of jobs in the early 20th century that were often the sort of lowest paid and least skilled. I think as the 20th century has moved on, you actually see women stepping more to the forefront. You see more female women designers, and their role has definitely developed from something that was just an assistant to the men to people who actually hold their own with the men in the ceramics industry as a whole.
If we think back to, you know, two of the sort of monumental periods over the last 100 years, the Great War and the Second World War, from your kind of experience at Wedgwood then, what kind of a role did women have in the pottery industry at Wedgwood and also, you know, in the broader ceramics industry? How did they kind of not come into their own, but what kind of a role did they play during the Great War?
Women are really important during the First World War because all of a sudden a huge proportion of your male and relatively young workforce just disappear overnight. And all of a sudden you have these gaps in the ceramics industry that men have traditionally done. There are particularly sort of male-dominated parts in the ceramic factory, like working on the kilns, for instance, or in the warehouses, which are often very, very male-centric. With the Great War, there are gaps, and women increasingly are brought in to fill these gaps. So within Wedgwood, we lose a quarter of our workforce to the military during the First World War, and women take over their roles. They often step up to become, from being the assistant turners to the main turners.
Just going to stop you there.
I know I hit the microphone, I'm sorry.
Have we been okay throughout with that microphone? Because it is quite close to Lucy's top. There's been no noises, nothing like that.
No, it sounded fine.
If it does come through, tell me, okay? So I'm going to get you just to go back there. You were saying, so let's go back to kind of what kind of jobs they were doing, because there was just a touch on the mic. So what kind of jobs were they doing then during the Great War?
So you see women, whereas they perhaps been assistants to the men, say as the turners or the potters' assistants, they often become the main potters, the main turners and so on. Women also, not necessarily within Wedgwood, but further afield, say at Grimwades, they actually take over the kilns, and they're a very famous example of the Grimwade girls who actually have special lifting equipment in order to help them sort of get the goods into the kilns because it's heavy, dirty work. And there are sort of newspaper articles proclaiming, you know, how much work and how good the Grimwade girls are in doing this. But there are numerous examples across the ceramics industry of women doing their bit and actively doing their bit whilst the men are away during the First World War.
How important do you think it was that they kind of embraced these roles and that they took on these roles in terms of like the country's sort of productivity and how it moved forward during the war? How important was it that women were there doing these roles?
I'll have to think about that one. Start again. Without the women...
Can I just move the mic slightly over? Because I can just hear it when your hands are...
Oh, sorry. It's because they're so
that's
dry
fine.
and... They...
I just thought if I move it closer to where
Yeah.
your mouth is, then maybe...
Stop moving your hand. How important it was for women to do these jobs?
So I mean, really, we just want to hear, you know, I mean, are we good? Because it's true, because what would have happened if women weren't there doing those roles and what would have happened to the country? So, I mean, from your opinion and from your own research, how important do you feel it was that women embraced these roles and that they were doing them?
Without women during this period, you know, many of these big companies would have just sort of ground to a halt. And there is a train of thought that actually within the ceramics industry, within North Staffordshire, women actually assimilated better into these job roles because they had such a long history of working directly alongside the men. It was just a matter of just sort of being in charge rather than being the assistant. But certainly without them being there, you know, companies like Wedgwood and the numerous other ceramic companies in the area would not have carried on during the war.
And of course, obviously, at Wedgwood, there was Lucy Wedgwood. I mean, can you tell me a little bit about the role that Lucy Wedgwood played during the Great War and kind of her position within the factory?
So within Wedgwood, there are two perhaps really important females during this period. The first is Lucy Wedgwood, who was the wife of one of our managing directors, Cecil. After Cecil Wedgwood was killed on the Somme, Lucy replaces Cecil on the board of directors, and that's the place she occupies well into the 1930s with her own death. During the war as well, Cecil and Lucy's eldest daughter, Audrey, she also sort of takes over because initially they can't get a replacement manager on the factory. So she sort of learned the job processes, the job roles, the way the factory works, and sort of starts at the bottom and works her way up. So there are accounts of her traipsing around the factory in overalls and clogs covered in clay, learning at this time. But even further afield, places like Dudson, again, the Dudson female members of the family, again, they're vastly important in keeping the company going during that time.
How do you think, or what kind of a response do you think there was to suddenly having a woman on the board of directors and having a significant female input? Was there any reaction in the factory, or do you think, I don't know if there's any evidence, or what do you think the reaction might have been?
I'd like to think it would have been very positive, because certainly when you read the accounts of how Cecil Wedgwood was viewed and the shock it was to everybody when he was killed in action, that there would have been a great deal of respect for Lucy. And Lucy was also sort of working on the factory. I mean, she did sort of do some work on the welfare side of things. I mean, these weren't women who were sort of sat doing nothing. They did actually interact with people, and there was a general atmosphere of working within a family business, and you know, you looked up to, but they were approachable, the members of the Wedgwood family who were involved in running the business.
Fantastic. Now, kind of during the Second World War then, my grandma actually worked at Wedgwood, so I sort of know what she did. But what kind of roles did, I mean, obviously you're kind of moving on sort of, I don't know, almost 20 years or so. How did the roles which women played during the Second World War differ, and kind of when the men came back from fighting in the Great War, were women suddenly redundant in the factory? I mean, how did the factory change between the wars, maybe, we could say to start with?
So I think in between the wars, with the country reeling from the effects of it, there is definitely sort of this strife. I mean, after the war ends, there's almost that recession, which does cause a lot of difficulties for many, many people. And women sort of still carry on, but I think they are sort of like sidelined back in. But certainly the First World War, this generation of women, people like Millie Taplin, Susie Cooper, Clarice Cliff, all of these women are starting to come into the forefront, and they really start pushing forwards in terms of design and become very, very prominent characters. And this carries on into the 1930s and 40s. Certainly during the Second World War, again, the company felt an enormous influence by it. We were in the middle of trying to move factories, stopping our production at Etruria and moving it to Barlaston. So the type of work changed. We couldn't produce decorated wear, I should say, which traditionally had been for the last 20, 30 years a huge employer for women. So all these sort of things come into play during that time. That was a very good answer.
Do you feel... Yeah?
Sorry, can I move that mark again?
Then, so the Second World War, what kind of I know you sort of answered it, but I'll ask you again. What kind of jobs were women playing in the factory, not just at Wedgwood, but perhaps across the ceramic industry? How important were women during the Second World War to the pottery industry?
So women would still be working, say, on the jiggering or the jollying machine. So they'd have been very heavily involved in the decorating part of the process, among other parts of the factory. Very involved in perhaps the clerical side as well, sort of like women in the working on the offices and the typewriters. Certainly during the Second World War, women again sort of stepped back into like the male sort of dominated areas, but with the experience of the First World War only being a couple of decades previously, perhaps that shock to the system wasn't quite as bad as perhaps it had been for the First World War moving over. In terms of, I'm trying to think what else, what part of the question?
No, that's okay.
Can you take a slight step to your left again, please?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So from your kind of experience and research and so forth, sort of generally speaking, what do you think the workplace has been like over the years for women? I mean, obviously the workplace in general has changed in terms of attitudes towards women. But I mean, so going back, what do you think the pottery manufacturing, especially being a heavy kind of dirty industry, perhaps male dominated, what, from your experience, what do you think the attitudes towards women were like?
I think there has always been a recognised need for women to work in the ceramics industry in North Staffordshire. If you look back historically, even as late as 1904, there was an account by a factory inspector who said that women were looked on as being lazy if they didn't contribute to the family income by going to work, particularly in the ceramics industry, because at that time the other jobs in the area, like the mining, didn't bring in sufficient income for a family to survive off of. So there hasn't necessarily been like women have always been involved in working in the ceramics industry. What was the next bit about?
How do you think attitudes have changed? I mean, far be it to suggest that 100 years ago, I don't know if it was more, enlightened than other industries or not. But I mean, how would you feel attitudes have changed across the industry towards women's role? Have they kind of mirrored societies, for example, in more of a progressive attitude and so forth, or do you think they're different?
Yeah. So I think that as society as a whole has moved on, the way in which women are viewed within the ceramics industry has also changed. Certainly today you see women sort of in all parts of the factory, whether that be on the design team, working all the way through to the warehousing. So today there isn't necessarily that sort of gender division that we would have associated with, say, even 100 years ago.
That's a bit of a...
Sorry, Liz, can you do that one again, please, and take a step to your right? Okay,
I was doing that, was I? Sorry.
Yeah, it just the backlight.
I think we put you off putting this microphone
No,
I
it's
do apologise.
fine.
Sorry,
The Second World War is not my forte at the moment. If I'm still here in like 20 years' time, I promise I'll be on the Second World War.
I forgot what I asked now. Okay, we can put some overlays on that because it was a nice answer. Was that light and shot throughout the question, or was it just
that last one? Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just do that one again. Are we okay with the setup now? Is that okay?
Yeah. Do you want to come and have a look? Is it too harsh on the hair? Yeah. That's it.
So Lucy, just to go back again, just in terms of like the change in attitudes in the workplace, from your kind of research, knowledge, etc., how do you feel has kind of like attitudes toward women in the pottery industry, have they changed the same as general society then? Has it just sort of become more of a general, not acceptance and such, but is it kind of like more kind of like a level playing field for women almost? Is it developed?
So today you see women sort of in all aspects of the ceramics industry, sort of right the way from like the warehouse end, going all the way through to the design end. I do think there's been a definite greater acceptance in women not able, but perhaps in this sort of traditionally male-dominated role that women have actually made more inroads into. And today I don't think people bat an eyelid whether, it's a man or a woman working at whatever job they're happening to do.
Fantastic. Now this is a bit of a cheeky question, tell me to mind my own business, but from your kind of experience looking through the archive at Wedgwood, have women always earned the same amount as men, or have they earned a similar amount as men? Has there been any discrepancy in wages to your kind of knowledge?
Women have always been paid a significant quantity less than men, and actually it was the First World War that really sort of helped level the playing field a little bit in terms of the wages. On perhaps a good day, a woman might get 2/3 of a wage that a man would get for comparable work, and certainly as developments have gone over, you do actually see wages actually on the same par as a male wouldn't necessarily get for the same work.
Fantastic. Now, let me just check my question, I beg your pardon. Why then do you think, in your opinion, I mean, we've kind of detailed the impact of women working in the ceramics industry there. For you, why have women played such an important, do you think women have played an important part in the development of the ceramic industry? And if so, why do you think it's been important?
I really think in the 20th century, women have come to the forefront in design, and the designs of people like Clarice Cliff, Millie Taplin, Susie Cooper, they have all sort of helped define an age as a whole. So you look at the works of Susie Cooper, and for many people, she can be, I can't think of the word. it's not iconic, but
definitive.
yeah, thank you. So
We'll do it.
yeah.
Listen, do you feel? Do you want me to do the question again, or do you want?
Yeah,
to
go on. It just gives me a chance to try.
Do you think? Well, first of all, do you think women have been important to the development of ceramics in Stoke-on-Trent and North Staffordshire? And if so, why do you feel women have been so important?
So I think really that women have really played an enormous role in the design, basically, and many of these sort of famous women designers, like Clarice Cliff, like Susie Cooper, they really help define an age. So you look at Clarice Cliff's work, and it's so Art Deco. You look at Susie Cooper, and with the length of her career, you can sort of see 1940s, 50s going into the sort of wonderful 1960s swinging London type designs, and they are so iconic. They define a period in some ways. People can have them in their houses, and for it to be of the time. So women are at the forefront of doing that. And moving on today, you know, you can just look across the city and look at Emma Bridgewater. You know, she is again a hugely successful female designer running a business, which again are, you know, some very iconic pieces for the 21st century.
So in terms of, is that for you then where you feel the strength of women in the industry that's pushed it forward has been in the design side of things then?
Yes, I do think that women as designers have probably been moved forward the most in terms of their development.
What do you think from kind of your research that just as a general kind of women working perhaps more predominantly across the industry, perhaps, you know, in lots of different roles, perhaps more so than many other manufacturing industries, what do you think that maybe that brought to the workplace? What do you think? Do you think that? Well, I'll rephrase that actually. What do you think the kind of like attitude amongst women in the workplace was? Do you think that there was a solidarity? Do you think that there was a good relationship between women when they were working on the floor? Yes,
in terms of like a working relationship between women, you can sort of listen today of accounts of members of the decorating team coming together, having a meeting, and museum staff can't get a word in edgeways because they are so busy sort of reminiscing, and it still today strikes you as being a unit, you know, one in which women were working together and actually had fun and enjoyed it, and it was a good working environment. Certainly sometimes the conditions they were working in were never, you know, were always perhaps to be improved upon, but the camaraderie between these people, I think, is certainly lives on today.
Fantastic, it's a great answer. And kind of final question, with kind of one eye to the future as a woman who works kind, you know, in the pottery industry, how do you kind of like see the future then for women? I mean, I know that really in terms of, you know, male and women, for me there's not really much difference anymore. We can all do more or less the same work. But do you think nowadays then, how do you see women working within the pottery industry? It's interesting what you say earlier about there's any number of roles. You could be a chief executive, you could be a designer. How do you kind of see the future, as it were?
I think that we are still going places, and I still think there's a lot of opportunities that we can take hold of. But as a whole, I think looking back on our history, that women can still play an enormously important role in the design process and in the manufacturing process and the marketing, and I think it looks very positive still for women. That didn't really answer your question.
It's kind of good.
Yeah.
If you want to do a different answer, I think what I'm getting at is, I mean, they asked me to ask about the future, but I mean, for you and I and Steph, I dare say, it doesn't really matter if you're a man or woman as far as I'm concerned. Anyone can be a chief executive of a business. But I suppose that, you know, we just want something quite positive about, you know, women might have been designers in the past and what, but in the future, who knows? You could be anything, because we want to show this film to young women, you know, maybe at high school and so forth, and to hear from, you know, people like yourself and so forth who have good jobs in the ceramics industry. You can do whatever you want at the end of the day, can't you? I'll ask you one more time. Okay. We'll do it again. You give us that different answers, okay. But what do you think then, Lucy? I mean, in terms of kind of like the future of the ceramics industry, what kind of a role can women play in the future of the ceramics industry? So
all in all, I think the future of the ceramics industry is looking very bright. We're seeing more businesses coming back to Stoke-on-Trent.
Let's do that one again. There's a big cough in the back. One last time. The future of the ceramics industry. What kind of a role do you feel women can play in the future of the ceramics industry?
So I think on the whole, the future looks very positive for the ceramics industry and for the women who work within it. Businesses are opening up again in the ceramics industry in Stoke-on-Trent. They are constantly looking out for female designers, for workers on the factory, anybody who can put like a creative input, and I think that's sometimes where we really excel.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you very much for that. That's everything you would.
Marvellous, thank you.
Watch your head on.